Hi, I'm Rachel Martinez. For 28 years, my wealthy cousins called me the poor relation behind my back. At family gatherings, they'd whisper about my secondhand clothes and beat up Honda while flashing their Tesla keys and designer handbags. When my uncle Victor passed away last month, they didn't even invite me to the funeral. Derek texted me afterwards saying, "Don't worry about coming to the will reading. There's nothing there for people like you." But what my millionaire cousins didn't know was that Uncle Victor had been watching them his whole life. And what he left me didn't just change my bank account, it revealed who they really were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was hammering against my apartment window that Tuesday morning when I got the call from Thomas Brennan, Uncle Victor's attorney. I almost didn't answer because I was running late for work at the Rainier Valley Family Services Center, where I help homeless families find temporary housing. My phone had been buzzing all morning with unknown Seattle numbers, probably debt collectors or telemarketers, trying to sell me something I couldn't afford anyway. "Miss Martinez," the voice was formal, professional. "This is Thomas Brennan from Brennan and Associates. I represent your late uncle's estate. I need you to come in for the reading of Victor Martinez's will." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "I think you have the wrong Martinez family. My cousins already handled all that last week. I wasn't invited." There was a pause on the other end. "Miss Martinez, your uncle specifically requested your presence. Are you available this afternoon at 2 o'clock? I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth. My work clothes were clean but obviously from Target's clearance rack. The black slacks had a small stain near the knee that I'd tried scrubbing out for months. My blouse was nice enough, but it was the same one I wore to every important meeting because it was the only professional-looking shirt I owned that wasn't fraying at the edges. The drive to downtown Seattle in my Honda Civic felt like traveling to another planet. The law offices of Brennan and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower overlooking Elliott Bay. I had to pay $25 for parking, which meant I'd be eating ramen for dinner again this week. The elevator to the 42nd floor made my ears pop. Thomas Brennan was nothing like I expected. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office smelled like leather and old books, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made Seattle look like a miniature city spread below us. "Rachel," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Victor spoke of you often. Please, sit down." That's when I noticed I wasn't alone. My 3 cousins were already seated around a mahogany conference table that probably cost more than my annual salary. Derek wore a charcoal suit that screamed expensive, his Apple Watch catching the light as he drummed his fingers impatiently on the table. Melissa had her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect bun, her diamond earrings sparkling every time she turned her head to whisper something to her husband, Dr. James Thompson, who looked like he'd rather be performing surgery than sitting in a law office. Brandon, the youngest at 26, couldn't sit still. He kept checking his phone and muttering about missing some cryptocurrency trade opportunity. His designer sneakers probably cost more than I made in a month at the community center. "Now that everyone's here," Brennan said, opening a thick folder, "we can begin." Victor was very specific about how he wanted this handled. Derek leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Tom, I think there's been some confusion. Rachel doesn't need to be here for the family business discussions. Maybe she could wait outside while we handle the important stuff?" "Actually," Brennan replied calmly, "Victor's instructions were quite clear about Rachel's presence being mandatory for the entire reading." Melissa rolled her eyes. Uncle Victor always had a soft spot for charity cases. The words hit me like a slap. I felt my cheeks burn, but I forced myself to sit straighter in the leather chair. I'd heard variations of that comment my entire life. At Christmas dinners when I brought store-bought cookies while they arrived with catered platters. At birthday parties where my gifts came from the dollar store while theirs were wrapped in designer paper with elaborate bows. Brennan began reading the will in his measured professional voice. The first sections covered the expected items: the Mercer Island mansion to Derek, the investment portfolio to Melissa, various trust funds and properties distributed among the cousins. Each bequest was worth hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. I sat there feeling smaller with every dollar amount, wondering why I'd even been called to witness their windfall. And to my beloved niece Rachel Martinez, Brennan continued, who has dedicated her life to serving others while asking for nothing in return. I braced myself for some token gesture, maybe a few $1,000s or some piece of jewelry that had sentimental value but no real worth. Uncle Victor had always been kind to me, but kindness doesn't pay rent or student loans. I leave the entirety of Nexus Solutions, including all intellectual property rights, licensing agreements, and future royalties, currently valued at approximately $20 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I couldn't process what I'd just heard. Derek's mouth fell open. Melissa grabbed her husband's arm so hard he winced. Brandon actually dropped his phone. "I'm sorry," Derek stammered. "Could you repeat that? $20 million in company assets to Rachel Martinez." Brennan repeated matter-of-factly. "That's impossible." Melissa's voice was shrill. "Uncle Victor sold Nexus Solutions years ago. We all know that." Brennan pulled out another set of documents. "Victor sold the operational assets of the company, but retained all rights to the proprietary software algorithms. Those patents have been generating substantial licensing fees from major tech corporations. The revenue stream has grown exponentially over the past 5 years." I felt dizzy. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them in my lap. $20 million. I made $48,000 a year helping families avoid eviction, and my uncle had just left me enough money to buy a small country. "There has to be some mistake," Derek said, his voice rising. "Rachel doesn't know anything about business. She works at some homeless shelter. She can't even afford a decent car. The will is quite specific." Brennan replied. Victor was very clear about his reasoning. "Would you like me to read his personal statement?" Before anyone could object, he continued. "Rachel has shown me what true wealth looks like. While others in our family have chased money and status, she has chosen service and sacrifice. She lives modestly not because she lacks ambition, but because she prioritizes helping others over helping herself. She understands that real value comes from lifting
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
people up, not climbing over them. The irony that she has been called our family's poor relation is not lost on me. She is the richest person I know. The tears started flowing before I could stop them. Not because of the money, though that was overwhelming, but because someone had finally seen me. Really seen me. All those years of being talked down to, excluded from family business discussions, treated like the relative everyone had to tolerate out of obligation, Uncle Victor had been paying attention. This is ridiculous. Brandon finally found his voice. She probably manipulated him. Old people get confused about money. Victor was sharp as a tack until the day he died. Brennan said firmly, "I worked with him for 15 years. This decision was made 3 years ago, and he reconfirmed it multiple times." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "We're going to contest this. There's no way some social worker deserves Uncle Victor's legacy more than his actual family." You are his actual family," I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since entering the room. "He raised you like his own children after your parents died. He paid for your college educations, your graduate degrees, your wedding, even the down payment on your first house. Derek, what did you ever do for him in return?" "We visited him," Melissa protested. "We had dinner with him every month. When was the last time any of you called him just to talk? Not because you needed something, not because it was a holiday, but because you wanted to hear his voice." The silence that followed answered my question. I called him every Sunday for 10 years. I continued. When he had pneumonia last winter, who do you think drove him to his doctor appointments? When he was lonely after Aunt Patricia died, who spent weekends helping him organize her things so he could finally let go? It wasn't any of you. We were busy, Derek said defensively. We have careers, responsibilities. And I don't. The anger was building in my chest now. Years of suppressed frustration finally finding an outlet. I work 50 hours a week trying to keep families from sleeping in their cars. I volunteer at the food bank on Saturdays. I coach Little League for kids whose parents can't afford the fees. But somehow you think your stock portfolios and country club memberships make you more deserving. Brennan cleared his throat. There are additional provisions in the will that you should all be aware of. Victor has left detailed instructions for Rachel regarding the management of her inheritance, including his recommendation that she consider establishing a foundation focused on affordable housing and family services. I looked around the table at my cousins' faces. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something uglier. Resentment. Calculation. The kind of expressions people get when they realize they've underestimated someone they thought they could control. Rachel. Derek's voice was suddenly smooth, conciliatory. Listen, we're family. We can work something out. You don't know anything about managing this kind of money. Let us help you. We can set up a family trust, make sure everyone benefits. Like the trust fund Uncle Victor set up for your kids' college education. I asked, the one where you're the sole trustee, and somehow the balance keeps getting smaller every year. Derek's face flushed red. That money is for legitimate educational expenses. Does Brandon's cryptocurrency trading count as educational? I looked at my youngest cousin, who was suddenly very interested in his designer sneakers. Or maybe Melissa's husband's golf club membership is somehow related to the kids' schooling. How do you know about any of that? Melissa demanded. Uncle Victor told me. He knew exactly where that money was going. He also knew about Derek's gambling problem and the $50,000 he borrowed from the business account last year. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Derek's face went from red to pale in seconds. He paid it back. Derek said quietly. After Uncle Victor confronted you about it. He also paid off your credit cards, didn't he? The ones Melissa doesn't know about. I watched Derek's wife turn to stare at her husband with dawning comprehension and fury. The family dynamics that had always been hidden beneath polite conversation were suddenly laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room. Victor kept detailed records of all his financial assistance to family members over the years. Brennan interjected. He wanted Rachel to understand the full scope of his previous generosity. So this is punishment? Brandon asked, his voice cracking slightly. He's punishing us for accepting his help. No, I said, standing up from my chair. This is recognition. He's recognizing that I never asked him for anything. I never came to family dinners with my hand out. I never called him when I was behind on rent or needed a co-signer for a car loan. I loved him for who he was, not what he could give me. The truth hung in the air between us like a physical presence. For years I'd been the poor cousin, the one who didn't belong in their world of expensive restaurants and luxury vacations. Now suddenly, I was the one with the power, and none of us quite knew how to handle the reversal. Brennan spent the next hour explaining the technical aspects of the inheritance, the various licensing agreements, the patent portfolio, the projected revenue streams. My head was spinning with numbers and legal terminology I barely understood. The only thing that was crystal clear was that my life had just changed in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. As we prepared to leave, Derek made one last attempt at damage control. Rachel, let's get coffee tomorrow. Just family, no lawyers. We need to discuss how this affects everyone. I looked at him for a long moment. The same Derek who had made jokes about my thrift store clothes at last Christmas dinner. The Derek who had told his friends I was the family charity case. The Derek who had just learned that the charity case was now worth more than all of them combined. "I'll think about it," I said. The elevator ride down to street level felt like descending from one world into another. Outside the gleaming tower, Seattle looked exactly the same as it had 3 hours earlier, but everything felt different. The parking attendant, who took my $25, smiled at me the same way he always did, like someone who understood what it meant to work for every dollar. I realized with a start that tomorrow, I might never have to worry about $25 parking fees again. Driving home through the familiar neighborhoods of Capitol Hill, I passed the coffee shop where I sometimes splurged on a $4 latte as a weekend treat. I drove past the grocery store where I clipped coupons and calculated the cost of every item in my cart. I passed the community center where I'd be back tomorrow morning, helping Mrs. Washington find a place to live with her 3 kids after their apartment building had been condemned. The inheritance hadn't changed who I was, but it had given me something I'd never had before: choices. For the first time in my adult life, I could choose based on what was right, instead of what I could afford. My phone had been buzzing constantly since leaving the law office. Text messages from Derek, missed calls from Melissa, voicemails from Brandon, all of them wanting to talk, to explain, to repair relationships that had been strained by years of condescension and casual cruelty. But for tonight, I just wanted to sit in my small apartment with my beat-up Honda parked on the street outside and process what had happened. I opened my laptop and began researching affordable housing foundations. If Uncle Victor thought I should use this money to help people, then that's exactly what I was going to do. But first, I had some family relationships to figure out. Because $20 million doesn't just change your bank account, it changes how everyone around you sees you, and how you see yourself. The rain was still falling against my window, but somehow it sounded different now. Less like a burden, and more like a promise. Parts 2. 5. The absence context. Through emotional processing, I hadn't always been the poor cousin. Growing up, we were all just kids running around Uncle Victor's massive backyard during family barbecues, splashing in his pool, hiding in the maze of rhododendron bushes that lined his property on Mercer Island. Back then, nobody cared that my mom bought my clothes at JCPenney while Derek's parents shopped at Nordstrom. We were family. Everything changed when I turned 18 and chose Pacific University for college instead of the University of Washington, where my cousins went. Not because I preferred the smaller campus in Forest Grove, Oregon, but because it was the only school that offered me enough financial aid to make higher education possible. While Derek pledged the most expensive fraternity on campus and Melissa joined a sorority known for its wealthy members, I worked 3 part-time jobs to cover my living expenses and took out loans for everything else. The summer after my freshman year, I came back to Seattle expecting things to be the same. They weren't. Derek had an internship at his father's investment firm, complete with company car and expense account. Melissa was planning a semester abroad in Italy, funded by her parents' travel budget that exceeded my entire annual income. Brandon, still in high school, was already talking about which luxury car he wanted for his 16th birthday. Meanwhile, I was stocking shelves at a grocery store and living in my mom's basement apartment, trying to save enough money for textbooks. The economic divide that had always existed but remained unspoken was suddenly impossible to ignore. During family dinners, the conversation revolved around stock portfolios and real estate investments, topics I knew nothing about because I was focused on whether I could afford both lunch and gas money for the week. Uncle Victor was the only one who seemed to notice I'd become an outsider in my own family. He'd find excuses to talk with me away from the group, asking about my classes and my plans for the future. When I mentioned wanting to work in social services after graduation, he nodded approvingly while my cousins exchanged glances that clearly said typical Rachel, always thinking small. The pattern continued through college and into my 20s. Every family gathering became a showcase of their latest achievements and acquisitions. Derek got promoted to vice president before he turned 28, bought a downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Elliott Bay that cost more than most people's entire lifetime earnings. He'd show us photos on his phone during dinner, casually mentioning the monthly mortgage payment like it was pocket change. Melissa married Dr. James Thompson in a wedding that looked like something from a magazine. The venue alone cost $60,000, more than I made in my first year out of college. She moved into a gated community in Bellevue, complete with a 3-car garage and a kitchen that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens. Every conversation became an opportunity to mention the personal trainer, the housekeeper, or the nanny they were interviewing for kids they didn't even have yet. Brandon took a different approach to displaying wealth, but the message was the same. He started day trading cryptocurrency and made it his full-time job by age 24. His social media accounts were carefully curated exhibitions of expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and exotic cars. He'd show up to family events wearing shoes that cost more than my monthly rent, talking about his latest investment strategy like he was Warren Buffett reincarnated. I kept showing up because they were family, but each gathering felt like entering a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. They'd discuss their financial advisors while I tried to figure out how to pay off my student loans faster. They'd debate whether to vacation in Aspen or the Hamptons, while I was excited about a camping trip to Olympic National Park that would cost me $50 in gas and park fees. The worst part wasn't their wealth itself, but how they talked about people who didn't have it. Derek would complain about homeless individuals downtown affecting his property values. Melissa would discuss her charity work like she was doing humanity a favor by attending fundraising galas where the ticket price could feed a family for months. Brandon would make jokes about people who drove older cars or lived in apartments, apparently forgetting that description fit his own cousin. They developed this habit of giving me helpful advice that was really thinly veiled criticism. Derek suggested I should consider getting my MBA to elevate my career prospects. Melissa recommended a financial advisor who could help me make better choices with my money, as if my problem was poor investment decisions rather than having no money to invest. Brandon once offered to teach me about cryptocurrency trading, explaining it like I was a child who needed guidance understanding basic economics. The breaking point came at Christmas dinner 2 years ago. I'd spent weeks planning and saving to buy thoughtful gifts for everyone, carefully selecting items I knew they'd appreciate within my extremely limited budget. I gave Derek a first edition of his favorite business book that I'd found at a used bookstore and had professionally cleaned and rebound. It cost me $200 I couldn't really afford, but I wanted to show I'd put thought and effort into finding something meaningful. He opened it, glanced at it briefly, and said, "Oh, vintage books. How quaint. I actually prefer digital copies now, much more convenient." Then he handed me my gift, a $500 gift card to Nordstrom, which felt more like a statement about my inadequate wardrobe than a genuine present. Melissa was worse. I'd found a beautiful handmade ceramic vase from a local artist, something unique that would complement her expensive home decor. She smiled politely and said, "This will be perfect for the guest bathroom." Then she gave me a gift basket full of luxury skincare products, explaining that she'd had her esthetician put together items that would help with my complexion issues. Brandon didn't even pretend to care about the vintage vinyl record I'd tracked down for him. He was too busy showing everyone his new watch, a limited edition piece that cost more than I made in 6 months. His gift to me was a subscription to a meal delivery service, because apparently my lifestyle needed that level of intervention too. But it was the conversation that happened after gift exchange that finally opened my eyes to how they really saw me. I was in the kitchen helping Uncle Victor clean up when I overheard them talking in the living room. They thought I was outside getting something from my car. Poor Rachel. Melissa sighed dramatically. She tries so hard, but she just doesn't get it. That vase probably came from some thrift store. She bought it from a local artist. Derek corrected. I saw the tag. She probably spent way more than she should have, trying to impress us. That's exactly the problem, Brandon added. She doesn't understand money, she makes these emotional decisions instead of practical ones. Like working at that community center instead of getting a real job. It's sad, really, Melissa continued. Uncle Victor feels sorry for her, but charity only goes so far. At some point, people have to help themselves. I stood frozen in the kitchen, Uncle Victor's hand on my shoulder. He'd heard it too. His face was grim, disappointed in a way I'd never seen before. That's when he whispered to me, some people mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for foolishness. They'll learn the difference eventually. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I should have paid closer attention to the way his jaw tightened and his eyes hardened as he looked toward the living room where his other nieces and nephews were casually destroying my character. After that night, I started declining family invitations. Not dramatically, or with explanations that would cause conflict, but gradually. I'd have to work late, or I'd already made plans, or I wasn't feeling well. Uncle Victor would call me separately, inviting me to smaller gatherings, or asking me to lunch, just the two of us. Those conversations became the highlight of my month. He never directly criticized his other relatives, but he'd ask pointed questions about my work that showed he understood and respected what I was trying to accomplish. When I told him about helping a family avoid eviction by connecting them with emergency rental assistance, he listened with genuine interest. When I explained a new program I'd developed to help kids from low-income families get access to after-school tutoring, he asked detailed questions about implementation and outcomes. During one of our lunches, about 6 months before he died, he said something that stuck with me. Rachel, wealth isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what you contribute. Some people spend their whole lives collecting things and calling it success. Others spend their lives lifting people up and think they're failing because they don't have much to show for it materially. I've been watching this family for a long time, and I know which approach creates real value. I thought he was just being encouraging, the way family members do when they want you to feel better about your circumstances. I had no idea he was making a judgment that would change all our lives. The last time I saw all my cousins together was Uncle Victor's 70th birthday party 8 months ago. By then, the pretense of treating me as an equal had been completely abandoned. I arrived at his Mercer Island home to find Derek, Melissa, and Brandon already there, sitting around the dining room table with calculators and legal documents spread between them. Oh good, Rachel's here, Melissa said without looking up from her paperwork. We're trying to figure out the best way to structure Uncle Victor's estate planning to minimize tax implications. You can keep him company while we handle the complicated stuff. I have a degree in social work with a minor in business administration, I replied quietly. I might be able to help. Derek laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. Rachel, this is advanced financial planning. We're talking about asset protection, trust structures, generation skipping transfer taxes. It's not exactly your area of expertise. Plus, Brandon added, this doesn't really affect you anyway. Uncle Victor's been incredibly generous with all of us over the years, but the major estate decisions are going to impact people who are in a position to actually manage significant assets. I sat with Uncle Victor on his back patio while they continued their calculations inside. He was quieter than usual, watching the sunset over Lake Washington with an expression I couldn't quite read. After a while, he said, they assume they know what I'm thinking, what I want, what I value. They've never asked me directly. What do you value, Uncle Victor? He was quiet for so long, I thought he hadn't heard the question. Finally, he said, I value people who show up when there's nothing in it for them. People who choose service over self-interest. People who understand that real wealth comes from what you give, not what you get. That was the last meaningful conversation we had. 2 months later, he had a heart attack while working in his garden. By the time I heard about it, the funeral arrangements had already been finalized. Derek called to let me know when and where, but the way he phrased it made it clear my attendance was optional. It's going to be pretty small, he said, just immediate family and a few business associates. You're welcome to come, of course, but don't feel obligated. We know you've got your work commitments and everything. The message was clear: you're not really immediate family, and we all know your job isn't important enough to excuse missing work for a funeral. I went anyway, taking a personal day I couldn't afford to lose. I sat in the back of the church, watching my cousins accept condolences and sympathy like they were the only ones who'd lost someone important. After the service, I approached Derek to ask about visiting Uncle Victor's house one last time, maybe taking something small as a keepsake. He looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances with Melissa before answering. Actually, we're trying to get the estate settled as quickly as possible, he said. The house needs to be cleared out and prepped for sale. We've got a crew coming in next week to handle everything efficiently. A crew? Professional estate sale company. They'll sort through everything, keep what has value, and dispose of the rest. It's really the most practical approach. What about personal items? Photos, letters, things with sentimental value? Melissa stepped forward. Rachel, we understand this is emotional, but we're trying to handle Uncle Victor's affairs in a way that honors his practical nature. He was a businessman. He'd want us to be efficient about this process, not get bogged down in sentiment. That's when Derek delivered the final blow. Besides, the will reading is just a formality. Tom Brennan has already given us the basic outline. Don't worry about coming to that either. There's nothing there for people like you. People like you. The phrase echoed in my head for weeks afterward. People like me who worked for social services instead of investment banks. People like me who drove 10-year-old cars instead of luxury vehicles. People like me who cared more about helping others than accumulating wealth. People like me who apparently didn't deserve to grieve or remember or have any claim on family legacy. That's why Thomas Brennan's phone call hit me like lightning on that rainy Tuesday morning. That's why I sat in my beat-up Honda in the parking garage of his downtown office building, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. That's why the number 20 million felt both impossible and perfect at the same time. Uncle Victor had been watching. He'd been listening. He'd seen how his other relatives treated the family member who'd chosen service over success, and he'd made a decision that would change everything. Now I was driving home through the Seattle streets I knew so well, past the grocery store where I'd counted every dollar, past the gas station where I'd calculated whether I could afford to fill my tank or just put in $10 to get through the week. The rain was still falling, but somehow the city looked different through my windshield. Brighter, full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Derek, Melissa, and Brandon. All of them wanted to talk, to explain, to find a way to make sense of what had just happened in that conference room. But I wasn't ready to talk to them yet. I needed time to process not just the inheritance but the revelation of how completely I'd been excluded from family decisions that affected my own legacy. For 28 years I'd accepted their casual dismissal of my worth. I'd internalized their message that my choices made me less valuable, less deserving, less important to the family structure. I'd shown up to their gatherings and smiled politely while they talked about investments I couldn't make and lifestyles I couldn't afford. I'd listened to their advice about improving myself, changing careers, making better financial decisions, as if the problem was my judgment rather than my circumstances. But Uncle Victor had seen something different. He'd recognized that while they were focused on accumulating wealth, I was focused on creating value. While they were building bank accounts, I was building community. While they were climbing social ladders, I was helping other people find their footing on the bottom rungs. The inheritance wasn't just about money, though $20 million would certainly change my material circumstances. It was about validation. It was proof that someone had been paying attention to the choices I'd made and the person I'd become. Someone had noticed that I'd never asked for handouts or special treatment, that I'd found ways to contribute even when I had very little to offer. As I pulled into my apartment complex and parked in my assigned space, I realized that tomorrow everything would be different, not just because I'd suddenly become wealthy, but because the family dynamic that had defined my adult life had been completely overturned. The poor cousin was now the rich one, and everyone was going to have to figure out what that meant. But tonight I just wanted to sit in my small apartment with my thrift store furniture and my student loan statements and try to understand how the person who'd been excluded from estate planning discussions had just inherited an estate worth more than all of theirs combined. The rain kept falling outside my window, and for the first time in years I wasn't worried about anything at all. Part 6-9, The Investigation Through the Smoking Gun Evidence. The coffee shop on Pine Street was Derek's suggestion, neutral territory where we could talk without the formality of offices or the emotional weight of family homes. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where I could see the entrance and have my back to the wall. Old habits from years of being ambushed by family conversations where I was the topic but not the participant. Derek walked in exactly on time, scanning the room until he spotted me. He looked different than he had in the law office yesterday, less polished, more uncertain. His usual confident stride seemed forced, and when he sat down across from me, I noticed dark circles under his eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. "Rachel," he began, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're trying to manage a volatile situation. "Thank you for meeting me. I know yesterday was overwhelming for everyone." Overwhelming is one word for it. He ordered an elaborate drink with multiple specifications while I nursed the black coffee I'd been sipping for 20 minutes. The barista's familiarity with his order suggested this wasn't his first time trying to impress someone at this particular location. "Look, I want to be completely transparent with you," Derek continued, leaning forward with his elbows on the small round table. "What happened yesterday caught all of us off guard. None of us had any idea Uncle Victor was planning something like this." "Really? Because from where I was sitting it seemed like you all had the estate figured out pretty thoroughly. Remember the birthday party? The calculators and legal documents spread across his dining room table while I was relegated to patio duty." Derek's jaw tightened slightly. "That wasn't about excluding you, Rachel. We were trying to help Uncle Victor organize his affairs. You know how overwhelming financial planning can be for elderly people. Elderly people. He was 70 years old and sharper than any of us. He built a tech company from nothing and sold it for hundreds of millions of dollars. I think he could handle his own financial planning." "You're right, you're absolutely right." Derek held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Poor choice of words. What I meant was we were trying to make sure he had all his options laid out clearly. We thought we were being helpful." I studied his face, looking for tells the way Uncle Victor had taught me during our poker games when I was 12. The slight tightness around his eyes, the way his left hand kept adjusting his watch, the practiced sincerity that didn't quite reach his voice. He was working an angle. "Derek, what do you want?" "I want our family to stay together through this transition. I want to make sure everyone's interests are protected, including yours, especially yours." "My interests seem to be doing fine, thanks to Uncle Victor." "That's exactly what I want to talk about." Derek leaned back, switching tactics. "Rachel, you've spent your entire career helping people, right? That's what you do at the community center. You help families navigate complex systems they don't understand." I nodded, unsure where he was heading. "Well, managing a $20 million inheritance is a complex system. There are tax implications, investment strategies, legal structures that need to be maintained. The Nexus Solutions licensing agreements alone involve contracts with 17 different companies across 4 countries. Do you even know what intellectual property licensing means in practical terms?" "I'm learning." "Of course you are, and that's admirable. But learning on the job, when you're dealing with this magnitude of assets, could be costly. One wrong decision, one missed deadline, one misunderstood clause in a licensing agreement, and you could lose millions." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Are you suggesting I'm not capable of handling my inheritance?" I'm suggesting that none of us would be capable of handling it alone. This isn't about capability, Rachel. It's about specialization. You're brilliant at what you do, but what you do is social work, not international business law or investment portfolio management. So what are you proposing? Derek's relief was visible. He'd been building to this moment, and I'd given him the opening he wanted. A family partnership. We pool our resources and expertise. I handle the investment side. Melissa manages the real estate portfolio. Brandon focuses on the tech assets since he understands that sector. You maintain your role as the primary beneficiary, but you have support from people who understand these markets. And what do you all get out of this arrangement? Management fees, standard industry rates, nothing excessive, just compensation for the professional services we'd be providing. Plus, it keeps the wealth in the family instead of paying outsiders who don't have our best interests at heart. I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. Less than 24 hours after learning they'd been cut out of the inheritance they'd assumed was theirs, they'd already developed a plan to get their hands on it anyway. Derek, let me ask you something. In all those family dinners where you discussed my poor financial choices, did it ever occur to you that maybe I made those choices deliberately? That maybe I chose social work because I wanted to help people, not because I was too stupid to understand investment banking? Rachel, I never said you were stupid. You didn't have to say it. It was in every piece of unsolicited advice, every helpful suggestion about my career, every gift card you gave me instead of asking what I actually wanted for Christmas. You all decided I was the family charity case who needed guidance and management. Derek's composure cracked slightly. We were trying to help. We could see you struggling financially, and we wanted to support you. You wanted to fix me. There's a difference. Maybe we went about it wrong, but the intentions were good. And now, I'm trying to make sure you have the support you need to handle this responsibly. Whose definition of responsibly are we using here? The question hung between us, while Derek processed what I was really asking. His carefully prepared pitch wasn't landing the way he'd expected, and I could see him recalibrating. Rachel, what are you planning to do with the money? I haven't decided yet. But Uncle Victor mentioned something about establishing a foundation focused on affordable housing and family services. That sounds like a good starting point. Derek's face went pale. A foundation. Rachel, do you understand what that means? You'd be giving away millions of dollars to strangers instead of securing your own future. I'd be using the money to help people who need it, the same way I've been doing for years, just on a larger scale. But you'd be broke again within 5 years. Foundations have massive overhead costs, regulatory requirements, administrative expenses. You'd spend more money running the foundation than actually helping people. Derek, you run an investment firm that charges clients 2% annually to manage their portfolios. Don't lecture me about administrative expenses. That's completely different. Investment management provides returns that exceed the fees. A foundation just spends money with no return on investment. Unless you consider helping people a return on investment. Derek stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. This was the fundamental difference Uncle Victor had recognized, the reason he'd made the decision he did. Derek could only see value in terms of financial returns. The idea that money might be valuable because of what it could accomplish for others was literally incomprehensible to him. Rachel, I'm going to be direct with you because we're family and I care about your welfare. You're not thinking clearly about this. Yesterday was emotional, the inheritance was a shock, and you're making decisions based on feelings instead of facts. Give yourself some time to process before you commit to anything irreversible. What I'm hearing is that you think I'm too emotional and inexperienced to handle my own inheritance, so I should let you manage it for me while I focus on my little social work hobby. I didn't say hobby, you didn't have to. Derek leaned forward again, dropping the pretense of casual conversation. Rachel, let me be completely honest. Melissa and Brandon are furious. They feel like Uncle Victor's decision was unfair, maybe even influenced by his declining mental state in his final months. They're talking about contesting the will. On what grounds? Undue influence. The argument would be that you manipulated a lonely elderly man who wasn't thinking clearly after his wife's death. They'd point to how much time you spent with him in his final years, how you isolated him from the rest of the family. The accusation hit me like ice water. Isolated him. I was the only one who visited him regularly. I was the only one who called him just to talk, not because I needed something. I know that, and you know that, but in a legal proceeding it could be presented differently. A young woman with financial problems, who suddenly starts spending lots of time with her wealthy uncle, gradually turning him against his other relatives, until she's the sole beneficiary of his estate. It's a narrative that might be compelling to a jury. Are you threatening me, Derek? I'm warning you. I'm trying to prevent a family war that would be devastating for everyone involved. Legal contests drag on for years, cost hundreds of thousands in attorney fees, and destroy relationships permanently. Nobody wins except the lawyers. So your solution is for me to voluntarily give up my inheritance to avoid a legal fight you're threatening to start. My solution is for us to work together as a family. You keep the inheritance, but you accept guidance from people who understand wealth management. Everyone benefits, nobody gets hurt, and we avoid a destructive legal battle. I stood up from the table, leaving my half-empty coffee cup behind. Derek, let me save you some time and attorney fees. Uncle Victor's decision was completely voluntary, thoroughly documented, and legally sound. I didn't manipulate him, influence him, or isolate him from anyone. I loved him, and he knew the difference between love and greed. Derek stood up too, his voice rising slightly. Rachel, you're making a mistake. This offer won't be available indefinitely. If you force us into a legal fight, everything changes. You're right, I said, slinging my purse over my shoulder. Everything does change. But it already changed yesterday when I learned how my own family really sees me. I walked out of the coffee shop feeling both liberated and exhausted. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected since leaving the law office. My cousins weren't interested in reconciliation or family harmony, they were interested in damage control and asset recovery. The inheritance hadn't changed their fundamental view of me as someone who needed their guidance and management. It had just raised the stakes. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa as I reached my car. Derek said coffee didn't go well. Can we try again? Just us girls? I almost deleted the message, but something made me hesitate. Melissa had always been the most subtle of my cousins, the one who wrapped her condescension in concern, and her judgment in helpful suggestions. If Derek's direct approach had failed, maybe she was trying a different strategy. I texted back. Sure, when and where? Nordstrom Cafe at Bellevue Square, tomorrow at 2. My treat. Of course it would be Nordstrom, the department store that represented everything I couldn't afford, in the shopping center that epitomized the lifestyle gap between us. But I was curious to hear Melissa's version of the family partnership pitch. The next afternoon, I walked through Bellevue Square, feeling like an anthropologist studying an alien culture. The stores were temples to luxury consumption, filled with items that cost more than most people made in a month. Well-dressed shoppers moved through the marble corridors, carrying bags from stores I'd only seen from the outside, their children clutching toys that probably cost more than my grocery budget. Melissa was already seated at a corner table in the Nordstrom Cafe, looking perfectly at home in her designer outfit and professionally styled hair. She stood to hug me, a gesture that felt both performative and genuine at the same time. Rachel, you look tired. Are you sleeping okay? It's been an eventful few days, I can imagine. Here, I ordered you a latte. I remembered you always get those when we're out together. I didn't have the heart to tell her I only ordered lattes when someone else was paying because they cost more than I usually spent on coffee in a week. The gesture was thoughtful, even if the reasoning behind it was complicated. Melissa, before we start, I want you to know that Derek already tried the family partnership pitch. If that's what this is about, you can save us both some time. Melissa's carefully composed expression flickered with surprise and something that might have been annoyance. Derek talked to you already. He wasn't supposed to do that until we'd all discussed the approach together. So you did coordinate this. Rachel, we're concerned about you. This inheritance is life-changing, but it's also dangerous if it's not handled properly. We want to make sure you have support. Support or supervision. Melissa stirred her salad absently, choosing her words carefully. Can I be completely honest with you? Woman to woman, no family politics, just the truth. I nodded. You scare us a little bit. That wasn't what I'd expected her to say. I scare you, not you personally, but what you represent. You've always been different from the rest of us, Rachel. You make choices we don't understand, you prioritize things we don't value, and now you have the resources to act on those priorities in ways that could affect all of us. How could my choices possibly affect you? Because we're family, whether we always act like it or not. What you do with Uncle Victor's money reflects on all of us. If you establish a foundation and start giving away millions of dollars, people will ask why his other relatives didn't stop you. If you make poor investment decisions and lose the money, it becomes a cautionary tale about our family's financial management. So this is about your reputations. Partly yes, but it's also about genuine concern for your well-being. Rachel, you've never had money before. You don't know how it changes people, how it changes relationships, how it changes everything. You're going to discover that people who ignored you before suddenly want to be your best friend. You're going to get pitched investment opportunities, charity requests, business propositions every single day. And you think I'm too naive to handle that? I think you're too trusting. It's one of your best qualities, but it could be dangerous when you're dealing with this magnitude of wealth. I sipped my latte, considering her words. Unlike Derek's obvious grab for control, Melissa's approach felt more nuanced, more psychologically sophisticated. She was appealing to my insecurities while positioning herself as a protective ally. Melissa, let me ask you something. In all the years we've been family, have you ever asked me about my work? Not made suggestions about how I could improve my career prospects, but actually asked me to explain what I do, and why it matters to me. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. After a long pause, she said, I don't think I have, no. Have any of you ever asked me about my goals, my dreams, what I want my life to look like? Or have you just assumed that what I want is what you have, and I just haven't figured out how to get it yet? Melissa's composure was cracking, and I could see her struggling with emotions she hadn't expected to encounter. Rachel, I think we've made assumptions. Yes, maybe we've been condescending without realizing it. Maybe, okay, we've definitely been condescending. We've treated you like the family member who needed guidance instead of the family member who made different choices. I can see how that would be hurtful. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from any of my cousins, and it caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the person Melissa might be underneath the perfectly curated exterior. But Rachel, she continued, that doesn't change the reality of the situation. You're about to inherit more money than most people see in multiple lifetimes. The learning curve is steep, the stakes are enormous, and the vultures are circling. You need allies who understand this world. Allies, or handlers. People who care about you and want to see you succeed. Define success. Melissa paused, clearly not expecting the question. Financial security, personal fulfillment, the ability to achieve your goals without worrying about money. What if my goals involve giving most of the money away? Then we'd want to help you do that as effectively as possible. But Rachel, there are smart ways to be philanthropic and dangerous ways. You could establish a foundation that operates efficiently and helps people for decades, or you could write checks to every charity that asks and be broke within 5 years while accomplishing very little. And you'd be willing to help me establish an effective foundation, even if it meant giving away money you think should have been yours. Melissa's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. Of course. If that's what you want to do with Uncle Victor's gift, we'd want to help you do it right. I finished my latte and set the cup down carefully. Melissa, I appreciate the apology, and I believe you're more sincere than Derek was yesterday, but you still don't get it. What don't I get? Uncle Victor didn't leave me that money because he thought I needed financial guidance. He left it to me because he trusted my judgment. The whole reason he chose me over you and Derek and Brandon is that I don't think about money the way you do. I don't see it as something to be accumulated and protected. I see it as something to be used. Used for what? For whatever needs to be done. Uncle Victor understood that. He knew I'd use his gift to help people because that's what I've always done with whatever resources I had available. Melissa leaned back in her chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You really think you can handle this alone, don't you? I think I can handle it with the right advisors and support system. But those advisors need to understand and respect what I'm trying to accomplish, not spend their energy trying to talk me out of it. And if you're wrong, if you make mistakes that cost millions of dollars, then I'll learn from them and do better next time. The same way I learned from every other mistake I've made in my life. Melissa nodded slowly, as if reaching some internal decision. Rachel, I want to show you something. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through emails until she found what she was looking for. This came in this morning. The screen showed an email from someone named Richard Caldwell, senior partner at Caldwell, Morrison and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of. The subject line read, regarding the Victor Martinez estate. Who's Richard Caldwell? I asked. One of the most expensive probate attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. Derek hired him yesterday. My stomach dropped. To contest the will, to explore the options for contesting the will. Richard specializes in cases involving undue influence and mental incapacity. He's very good at his job. I stared at the email, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. You're really going to do this? We're going to explore our legal options, yes. Derek and Brandon are convinced Uncle Victor was manipulated in his final months. They think you took advantage of his grief and isolation to influence his estate planning decisions. And what do you think? Melissa was quiet for a long moment, stirring the ice in her water glass. I think Uncle Victor knew exactly what he was doing. I think he made a deliberate choice based on years of observation and careful consideration. And I think Derek and Brandon are about to spend a fortune on legal fees to challenge a will they have no chance of overturning. Then why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand what you're up against. Derek is furious, Brandon is desperate, and they're both convinced they can win a legal fight. They're not going to accept Uncle Victor's decision quietly. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe there's a middle ground. Something that satisfies everyone's interests without destroying our family in a courtroom. I looked at her carefully, recognizing the setup. This was Melissa's pitch, more sophisticated than Derek's direct approach, but equally calculated. What kind of middle ground? A family trust. You maintain control as the primary beneficiary, but there are structured distributions that benefit everyone. Derek gets to manage the investment portfolio, Brandon gets a stake in the tech assets, I handle the real estate components. Everyone has skin in the game, everyone has incentive to see the money grow instead of disappear. And if I refuse, then Derek and Brandon pursue their legal challenge, and we spend the next 3 years in court fighting over Uncle Victor's intentions instead of honoring them. I felt the trap closing around me. They'd planned this perfectly, using Derek's aggressive approach to make Melissa's compromise seem reasonable. Good cop, bad cop, with the implicit threat of legal action forcing me to choose between maintaining my inheritance and maintaining my peace of mind. Melissa, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're offering to help me avoid a legal fight that you're threatening to start, unless I agree to share an inheritance that's legally and completely mine. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. No, you're trying to find a way to get your hands on money that Uncle Victor specifically chose not to leave you. The only reason you're being more diplomatic than Derek is that you think I'll respond better to manipulation than intimidation. Melissa's mask slipped completely. Rachel, you have no idea how to handle this kind of money. You're going to make mistakes that cost millions, and when you do, the family name suffers along with your bank account. There it is, I said, standing up from the table. The real concern isn't my welfare or my success. It's your family name and your social status. Sit down, Rachel, we're not done talking. Yes, we are. I picked up my purse and looked down at my cousin, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Melissa, you can tell Derek and Brandon that if they want to challenge Uncle Victor's will, they're welcome to try. They'll lose, and they'll spend a fortune doing it, but that's their choice. You're making a mistake, maybe, but it's my mistake to make. I walked out of Nordstorm Cafe feeling like I'd just escaped a beautifully decorated trap. The family partnership offer had never been about helping me succeed. It had been about maintaining their control over family wealth and their position in the social hierarchy they'd spent their lives climbing. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of Seattle, I realized that Derek and Melissa had accidentally given me something valuable. They'd shown me exactly what I was up against and exactly why Uncle Victor had made the choice he did. He'd seen this coming. He'd known they would never accept being cut out of what they considered their inheritance, and he'd trusted me to handle not just the money, but the family conflict that would inevitably follow. My phone buzzed with another text message, this time from Brandon. Rachel, we need to talk. This doesn't have to get ugly, but it already was ugly. It had always been ugly, hidden beneath polite family dinners and carefully worded Christmas cards. The inheritance hadn't created the dysfunction in our family relationships, it had just brought it into the light where we all had to look at it directly. I had some serious thinking to do about how to handle what was coming next. Parts 10-14, Strategic Planning Through Final Resolution. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail to my apartment door. I signed for it while still in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, expecting some routine correspondence from Thomas Brennan's office regarding the inheritance paperwork. Instead, I found myself staring at letterhead from Caldwell, Morrison and Associates, with Richard Caldwell's name embossed in gold letters across the top. The formal language made my stomach turn. Notice of intent to contest probate, followed by dense paragraphs of legalese that boiled down to a simple message: my cousins were officially challenging Uncle Victor's will. They alleged undue influence, mental incapacity and fraud. They claimed I had isolated Uncle Victor from his family, manipulated his grief over Aunt Patricia's death, and coerced him into changing his estate planning during a period of diminished mental capacity. Reading their accusations felt like being punched in the chest repeatedly. According to the legal filing, I was a calculating opportunist who had preyed on a vulnerable elderly man for financial gain. Every Sunday phone call, every dinner visit, every afternoon spent helping him organize Aunt Patricia's belongings was reframed as evidence of manipulation rather than love. The most painful allegation was that I had systematically alienated the decedent from his other family members through a campaign of emotional manipulation designed to position herself as his sole confidant and heir. They painted my genuine relationship with Uncle Victor as a calculated con game, complete with supporting documentation they claimed to have gathered from neighbors, household staff, and business associates. I called Thomas Brennan immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. Rachel, I was expecting your call, he said without preamble. You received Caldwell's filing? Thomas, they're saying I manipulated Uncle Victor. They're calling me a fraud. They're saying what they need to say to establish legal grounds for their challenge. These allegations are standard boilerplate language for undue influence cases. Don't take them personally. How can I not take them personally? They're attacking everything genuine about my relationship with my uncle, because that's exactly what they're designed to do. Richard Caldwell is very good at weaponizing family relationships for legal purposes. The goal is to make you doubt yourself, make you angry enough to react emotionally, or intimidate you into settling. What kind of evidence do they actually have? Thomas was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling on his end of the phone. According to their filing, they have testimony from Margaret Chen, Victor's former executive assistant. They claim she witnessed you pressuring Victor about his estate planning during his final months. My heart sank. Maggie Chen had worked for Uncle Victor for 15 years. She knew him better than almost anyone, and if she was supporting my cousin's version of events, it could seriously damage my case. Thomas, that doesn't make sense. Maggie and I got along fine. She never seemed to think I was manipulating anyone. People's memories can be influenced by subsequent events and leading questions. It's also possible they're misrepresenting what she actually said. We'll need to depose her to find out what she really witnessed. What else do they have? They've subpoenaed Victor's medical records from his final year, claiming they'll show evidence of cognitive decline that made him susceptible to manipulation. They also plan to call Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, his personal physician, to testify about his mental state. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dr. Morrison was the same physician who had marveled at Uncle Victor's mental acuity during his final months, commenting that he was sharper than patients half his age. If anything, her testimony would support my position, not theirs. Thomas, how strong is their case realistically? Honestly, it's weak on the merits but expensive to defend. That's the entire strategy. They're betting you can't afford to fight them in court for 2 or 3 years. The legal fees alone could exceed $500,000. And if I lose? If they successfully contest the will, the estate would be distributed according to Washington state intestacy laws, which would divide everything equally among Victor's surviving relatives. You'd receive the same share as Derek, Melissa, and Brandon. I did the math quickly. Instead of $20 million, I'd get $5 million, and my cousins would each get $5 million as well. Still a life-changing amount of money, but not the decisive validation Uncle Victor had intended. What do you recommend? Fight them. Victor's will is solid, his mental capacity was never in question, and your relationship with him is well documented as genuine and long-standing. But you need to be prepared for a long, ugly battle that will cost significant money and emotional energy. After hanging up with Thomas, I sat in my small apartment staring at the legal documents spread across my kitchen table. The certified mail envelope, the formal allegations, the timeline for responses and depositions. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about defending Uncle Victor's memory and my own integrity against people who were willing to destroy both for financial gain. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. Miss Martinez, this is Margaret Chen. I think we need to talk. Maggie's voice was strained, older than I remembered from the handful of times we'd spoken during my visits to Uncle Victor's office. She suggested we meet at a small diner in Redmond, away from the lawyers and family drama that had consumed our lives over the past week. I found her already seated in a corner booth, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands were folded precisely on the table in front of her, but there was something defeated about her posture that hadn't been there during her working years. Miss Martinez, thank you for coming, she said as I slid into the booth across from her. I wanted to speak with you before this legal situation gets completely out of control. Maggie, the lawyers are saying you have information that supports my cousin's case. Is that true? She sighed deeply, looking older than her 72 years. It's complicated. Yes, I spoke with their attorney, Mr. Caldwell. But what I told him and what he's planning to do with that information are two very different things. What did you tell him? I told him the truth about what I observed during Mr. Victor's final months, which is that you visited him frequently, that you two had long conversations about his estate planning, and that he seemed to value your opinion more than his other relatives' opinions. And Caldwell is presenting that as evidence of manipulation. He's presenting it as evidence that you had unusual influence over Mr. Victor during a vulnerable time in his life. He asked me leading questions about whether I thought Mr. Victor's judgment might have been compromised by grief, whether I noticed any changes in his decision-making after Mrs. Patricia died, whether your increased presence coincided with changes to his will. I felt a chill run down my spine. What did you say? I told him that Mr. Victor's judgment was as sharp as ever, that his decision-making was consistent and well-reasoned, and that your relationship with him was clearly based on genuine affection rather than financial interest. Then why are they listing you as a witness for their side? Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Because I also told him something else. Something I probably shouldn't have shared, but I was trying to be completely honest about what I observed. What? I told him about the conversation I overheard between Mr. Victor and his attorney 3 months before he died. Mr. Victor specifically mentioned his concerns about Derek's gambling problem, Melissa's entitlement issues, and Brandon's financial irresponsibility. He said he was worried about leaving them money they would waste or use destructively. My stomach dropped. Maggie, that supports Uncle Victor's decision to leave the money to me, not their claim that he was manipulated. That's what I thought too. But Mr. Caldwell explained that in legal terms it could be presented as evidence that Mr. Victor's family relationships had been poisoned by outside influence. He said a jury might conclude that you had systematically turned Mr. Victor against his other relatives by feeding him negative information about their financial habits. But that's not what happened. Uncle Victor knew about Derek's gambling and Brandon's spending problems because he was the one bailing them out financially. I never said anything negative about any of them. I know that and you know that, but Mr. Caldwell made it clear that legal proceedings aren't always about objective truth. They're about persuasive narratives presented to juries who don't know any of the people involved. Maggie leaned forward, lowering her voice. Miss Martinez, there's something else you need to know. Something I didn't tell Mr. Caldwell because I wasn't sure it was relevant. What? 3 weeks before Mr. Victor died, he called me into his office and asked me to witness the signing of some documents. It wasn't unusual. I'd notarized papers for him hundreds of times over the years. But these documents were different. Different how? They weren't business related. They looked like personal letters, and he was very specific about how they should be handled after his death. He put them in a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, with instructions that the box should only be opened in the event of a legal challenge to his will. My heart started racing. Did he say what was in the letters? No, but he made a comment that stuck with me. He said, Maggie, if my family tries to rewrite history after I'm gone, these letters will set the record straight. I think he knew this legal challenge was coming, Miss Martinez. I think he prepared for it. I stared at her across the diner table, processing this information. Uncle Victor had left behind insurance against exactly what was happening now. Whatever was in that safety deposit box could potentially end the legal challenge before it really began. Maggie, why are you telling me this? You could get in trouble with Caldwell for sharing information that helps my case. Because Mr. Victor was a good man who deserved better than having his final wishes twisted by lawyers and greedy relatives. And because you were kind to him during a difficult time in his life. You didn't deserve to have that kindness weaponized against you. Will you testify about the safety deposit box? If your attorney subpoenas me, I'll tell the truth about everything I know. But Miss Martinez, you should also know that Mr. Caldwell offered me money to emphasize certain aspects of my testimony and downplay others. He offered to pay you to lie. He offered to pay me to help the jury understand the full context of the family dynamics. His words, not mine. It wasn't technically asking me to lie, but it was asking me to present the truth in a way that would benefit their case. What did you tell him? I told him I'd testify honestly about what I witnessed, but I wouldn't accept payment for testimony in either direction. He wasn't happy about that. I left the diner feeling like I'd just been given a crucial piece of information that could change everything. The safety deposit box Uncle Victor had set up suggested he'd anticipated this exact scenario and taken steps to protect his true intentions from being misrepresented. Thomas Brennan was intrigued when I called him with Maggie's information. A safety deposit box with sealed documents. That's unusual, but it could be exactly what we need. I'll file a motion to access the box immediately. How long will that take? Probably 2 weeks for a court order assuming the bank cooperates. But Rachel, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that whatever Victor left behind might not be what we hope it is. What do you mean? Sometimes people leave behind documents that complicate matters rather than clarifying them. Personal letters can be emotional, rambling, or ambiguous. They might not provide the clear legal vindication we're looking for. But they might. They might. Victor was a careful man who thought strategically about business decisions. If he prepared for this legal challenge, he probably did it thoroughly. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of my life. I continued working at the community center, helping families navigate housing crises and bureaucratic obstacles. But my mind was constantly occupied with the pending legal battle. Derek, Melissa, and Brandon had gone completely silent, no longer attempting reconciliation or compromise. Their attorney had advised them to avoid any contact with me that could be construed as harassment or intimidation. The Seattle Times ran a story about the inheritance dispute, describing it as a cautionary tale about family wealth and estate planning. They interviewed several legal experts who offered conflicting opinions about the strength of my cousin's case. Reading about my personal life dissected by strangers in the newspaper was surreal and deeply uncomfortable. The court order to access Uncle Victor's safety deposit box was granted on a Tuesday morning. Thomas Brennan and I met at First National Bank downtown, accompanied by a court-appointed witness who would document everything we found. The bank manager, a professional woman in her 40s, led us into the vault area and used her master key along with the key from Uncle Victor's estate to open box number 347. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes, each marked with a specific name, for Rachel Martinez, for Derek, Melissa, and Brandon Martinez, and for the court. There was also a small digital recorder, an old-fashioned device that Uncle Victor had apparently used for dictating business correspondence. Thomas opened the envelope marked for the court first, as required by legal protocol. Inside was a single typed page dated 6 months before Uncle Victor's death, explaining that he had prepared additional documentation to clarify his intentions regarding his estate in the event of a legal challenge. The letter was vintage Uncle Victor, clear, logical, and comprehensive. He explained that he had been aware of his other relatives' financial problems and had observed their attitudes toward money and family responsibility over many years. He detailed specific instances of their requests for financial assistance, their lack of gratitude for previous help, and their general approach to wealth as something owed to them rather than something earned. In contrast, he described my character and choices with genuine admiration. He wrote about my decision to work in social services despite having the intelligence and education for more lucrative careers. He praised my independence, noting that I had never asked him for money or special treatment. Most importantly, he addressed the manipulation allegations directly. Rachel Martinez has never attempted to influence my estate planning decisions, he wrote. Her relationship with me has been characterized by genuine affection, respect, and companionship. She has listened to my concerns about family dynamics without encouraging those concerns or trying to profit from them. If anything, she has consistently encouraged me to maintain relationships with Derek, Melissa, and Brandon despite my growing disappointment with their behavior. The envelope marked for Rachel Martinez contained a longer, more personal letter that brought tears to my eyes. Uncle Victor had written about watching me grow up, about his pride in the woman I'd become, and about his confidence that I would use his gift wisely and compassionately. He explained his decision to structure the inheritance as he did, noting that he wanted to empower me to make a meaningful difference in the world rather than simply accumulate wealth. But it was the digital recorder that provided the most devastating evidence for my cousin's case. Uncle Victor had apparently recorded conversations with each of them over the past 2 years, documenting their requests for money, their complaints about his decisions, and their assumptions about their inheritance rights. Derek's voice was clear on the recording, arguing with Uncle Victor about his wasteful charitable giving and suggesting that the family money should be kept in the family rather than donated to strangers. Melissa could be heard complaining about having to compete with Rachel for Uncle Victor's attention and questioning whether his decision-making was being influenced by misplaced sympathy for her financial situation. Brandon's recorded comments were the most damaging. During what sounded like a family dinner, he made several derogatory remarks about my career choice and suggested that Uncle Victor was throwing money away on people who don't appreciate it when he made charitable donations. The recordings were dated, time-stamped, and clearly authentic. They demonstrated not only that my cousins had actively lobbied for inheritance benefits while criticizing my relationship with Uncle Victor, but also that Uncle Victor had been methodically documenting their behavior in anticipation of exactly this legal challenge. Thomas Brennan listened to the recordings with the focused attention of an attorney who knew he'd just been handed a winning case. Rachel, these recordings don't just defend against their undue influence claim. They actually support a counterclaim for malicious prosecution. What does that mean? It means we can argue that your cousins filed this lawsuit knowing their allegations were false, purely for the purpose of intimidating you into settlement. If we can prove malicious prosecution, they could be liable for your attorney fees and additional damages. Can we settle this without going to trial? We can certainly try. Once Caldwell hears these recordings, he'll probably advise his clients to withdraw their challenge. No attorney wants to take a case this weak in front of a jury, especially when the opposing evidence is this strong. The settlement negotiations took place the following week in a conference room at Thomas Brennan's office. Richard Caldwell arrived with Derek, Melissa, and Brandon, all of them looking significantly less confident than they had during our previous encounters. Caldwell was a silver-haired man in his 60s with the kind of polished demeanor that comes from years of high-stakes litigation, but even he seemed uncomfortable as Thomas presented our evidence. The recordings were played in their entirety, filling the conference room with the sound of my cousins' own voices making the case for why Uncle Victor's decision had been justified. Derek's complaints about charitable giving sounded petty and selfish when played back months later. Melissa's jealousy about my relationship with Uncle Victor was obvious and unflattering. Brandon's dismissive comments about my career and the people I helped revealed a callousness that was hard to defend. When the last recording ended, the room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Caldwell cleared his throat and looked at his clients with an expression that clearly conveyed his professional assessment of their prospects. Mr. Brennan, Caldwell said finally, I think there may be room for discussion about resolving this matter without further litigation. I'm listening, Thomas replied. My clients acknowledge that the evidence you've presented significantly undermines their position. They're prepared to withdraw their challenge to the will in exchange for a structured settlement that provides them with some financial consideration. I looked at Derek, Melissa, and Brandon sitting across the conference table from me. They couldn't meet my eyes, their earlier arrogance replaced by obvious embarrassment and desperation. These were people who had spent their lives believing they were entitled to Uncle Victor's wealth, and they were struggling to accept that their behavior had cost them exactly what they'd felt most entitled to receive. What kind of financial consideration? Thomas asked. Perhaps a payment of $500,000 to each sibling in exchange for their agreement not to pursue any further legal action and to publicly acknowledge that the will represents Victor Martinez's true intentions. I almost laughed. They wanted me to pay them $1.5 million to stop suing me for money that was already legally mine. The audacity was breathtaking, but I could see the calculation behind it. They were hoping I'd pay them to avoid the stress and expense of continued litigation, even though we both knew I'd win eventually. Counter offer, I said, speaking directly to my cousins for the first time since the meeting began. You withdraw your challenge, you pay my attorney fees to date, and you publicly apologize for making false allegations about my relationship with Uncle Victor. In exchange, I won't pursue a malicious prosecution claim against you. Derek's face flushed red. You want us to pay your legal bills? I want you to take responsibility for the costs of the legal action you initiated based on allegations you knew were false. We didn't know they were false when we filed. Melissa protested. You knew you had no evidence of manipulation or undue influence, I replied. You filed the lawsuit hoping to intimidate me into settlement, not because you believed you had a legitimate case. Brandon finally spoke up. Rachel, we're family. This doesn't have to be about punishment and revenge. You're right, it doesn't have to be. But it also doesn't have to be about rewarding people for making false accusations and filing frivolous lawsuits. Richard Caldwell intervened before the conversation could escalate further. Perhaps we could structure this differently. My clients withdraw their challenge and acknowledge the validity of the will. In exchange, Miss Martinez agrees not to pursue a malicious prosecution claim. Each side bears their own legal costs. Thomas looked at me with raised eyebrows, leaving the decision to me. It was a reasonable settlement that would end the legal challenge without additional cost or drama. But it also meant my cousins would face no consequences for their attempt to steal my inheritance through legal intimidation. I need to think about it, I said. Of course, Caldwell replied. Shall we reconvene tomorrow? I spent that evening walking around Capitol Hill, trying to process everything that had happened over the past month. 4 weeks ago, I'd been the poor cousin struggling to pay rent and student loans while my wealthy relatives looked down on my career choices and lifestyle. Now I was a multi-millionaire who held the power to determine their financial future as well as my own. The inheritance had given me something more valuable than money, though. It had given me validation. Uncle Victor's decision, documented so thoroughly and defended so strategically, was proof that someone had been paying attention to my choices and character all along. Someone had recognized that service to others was more valuable than service to self, that helping people was more important than accumulating wealth, that genuine relationships mattered more than financial transactions. My cousins had never understood that perspective, and based on their behavior during this legal challenge, they probably never would. But Uncle Victor had understood it, and he'd structured his final gift to reflect those values. The next morning, I returned to Thomas Brennan's office with my decision. I'll accept Caldwell's settlement terms. They withdraw the challenge, acknowledge the will's validity, and we each pay our own legal costs. But I want something else included. What? I want them to agree that they won't make any public statements about Uncle Victor's mental capacity, my relationship with him, or the circumstances of the inheritance. And I want a written apology, not public, just to me, acknowledging that their allegations were unfounded. Thomas nodded approvingly. That's reasonable and enforceable. The settlement was finalized that afternoon. Derek, Melissa, and Brandon signed documents withdrawing their legal challenge and acknowledging that Uncle Victor's will represented his true intentions. They agreed to pay their own legal costs and to refrain from making any public statements that questioned the legitimacy of the inheritance. The written apologies were brief and obviously drafted by their attorney, but they served their purpose. Each of my cousins acknowledged that their allegations of manipulation and undue influence had been unfounded, and that my relationship with Uncle Victor had been genuine and appropriate. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Derek paused at the door. Rachel, for what it's worth, I think Uncle Victor made the right choice. You'll use the money better than we would have. It was the closest thing to a genuine apology I'd received from any of them, and I appreciated the gesture even though it had come too late to repair the damage done to our relationships. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of the Rachel Martinez Foundation for Affordable Housing, a non-profit organization I'd established with a portion of Uncle Victor's gift. The foundation had already helped 12 families avoid eviction, funded emergency housing for 37 individuals, and provided down payment assistance for 8 first-time homebuyers. The work was exactly what I'd been doing at the community center, just on a much larger scale and with significantly more resources. I still drove my Honda Civic, still lived in my Capitol Hill apartment, still shopped at the same grocery stores and coffee shops I'd always frequented. The inheritance had changed my ability to help people, but it hadn't changed who I was or what I valued. Margaret Chen called me on a Thursday afternoon, 6 months after the settlement. Her voice was warm and familiar, carrying the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you've done the right thing. Miss Martinez, I wanted to let you know that I've been following the work of your foundation. Mr. Victor would be very proud of what you've accomplished. Thank you, Maggie. I think about him every day. I have something that belongs to you, she said. Something Mr. Victor asked me to give you after his legal affairs were settled. We met at the same diner in Redmond where she'd told me about the safety deposit box. This time she carried a small wrapped package that she placed on the table between us. He gave this to me 3 days before he died, she said. He told me to make sure you received it once you'd proven you could handle the challenges that came with his gift. Inside the wrapping was Uncle Victor's old pocket watch, the one he'd carried every day for 40 years. Engraved on the back were the words, "To Rachel, who always understood that time is the most valuable gift we can give to others. Use it wisely. Uncle Victor." I held the watch in my hands, feeling the weight of his trust and expectations. He'd known this legal challenge was coming, had prepared for it meticulously, and had trusted me to navigate it with integrity and strength. The watch was his final message, a reminder that time spent helping others was time well invested. My phone buzzed with a text from the community center where I still volunteered on weekends. Mrs. Washington, the mother of 3 I'd helped find housing months ago, had gotten a promotion at work and wanted to thank me for believing in her family when no one else would. I looked around the diner, at the working people grabbing lunch between shifts, at the families sharing meals they'd budgeted carefully for, at the retired couples stretching their fixed incomes to cover small luxuries like coffee and pie. These were Uncle Victor's people, the ones he'd built his fortune to serve through the foundation he'd entrusted to my care. Derek was right about one thing. Uncle Victor had made the right choice. Not because I was more deserving than my cousins, but because I understood that wealth was a tool for service, not a trophy for accumulation. The $20 million wasn't my prize for being the poor cousin who'd made good. It was my responsibility for being the family member who'd learned that true wealth comes from lifting others up. I put Uncle Victor's watch in my pocket and headed back to work. There were families to help, problems to solve, and a legacy to honor. The poor cousin had inherited more than money. She'd inherited purpose, and that made all the difference. 3 years had passed since that rainy Tuesday morning when Thomas Brennan called to change my life forever. The Rachel Martinez Foundation for Affordable Housing had grown from a single-person operation run out of my Capitol Hill apartment into a thriving organization with 12 full-time employees and a gleaming office space in South Lake Union. We'd helped over 300 families secure stable housing, prevented countless evictions, and established emergency shelter programs in 4 different counties across Washington state. The foundation's success had brought unexpected attention. I'd been featured on the cover of Seattle Business Magazine as one of the region's most influential philanthropists under 30. The mayor had invited me to serve on the city's Housing Advisory Committee. Universities called asking me to speak to their social work and public policy students about innovative approaches to addressing homelessness. But the recognition that meant the most came on a cold February morning when I received a handwritten letter from Mrs. Washington, the mother of 3 I'd helped find housing during my early days at the community center. Her eldest daughter had just been accepted to the University of Washington with a full scholarship. In her careful script, Mrs. Washington wrote that she'd told her daughter the story of how a social worker named Rachel had believed in their family when they had nowhere else to turn. "Because of you," she wrote, "my children learned that there are people in this world who help others without expecting anything in return. My daughter wants to study social work so she can be that person for someone else's family someday." I kept that letter framed on my desk, next to Uncle Victor's pocket watch and a photo of him teaching me to fish at Lake Chelan when I was 11 years old. The image captured something essential about who he'd been, the way he'd invested time in people rather than just portfolios, the way he'd measured success by impact rather than accumulation. My relationship with Derek, Melissa, and Brandon had settled into a careful distance. We exchanged Christmas cards with polite updates, but no invitations to family gatherings. Derek had moved to San Francisco after his investment firm was investigated for irregularities in client accounts. Melissa had divorced Dr. Thompson when his gambling debts became unmanageable, moving back to her parents' house with her 2 young children. Brandon had lost most of his cryptocurrency investments in a market crash and was working as a financial advisor for a small firm in Spokane. Their attempts to contest Uncle Victor's will had cost them more than just legal fees. The publicity around the case had damaged their reputations in Seattle's tight-knit business community. People remembered the recordings that revealed their attitudes toward charity and their sense of entitlement to inherited wealth. Job opportunities had dried up. Social invitations had stopped coming, and their carefully constructed images as successful young professionals had crumbled under scrutiny. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles. If anything, watching their lives unravel had reinforced my understanding of why Uncle Victor had been so concerned about their relationship with money. They'd never learned that wealth was a tool for building rather than a prize for claiming. When they lost access to easy money, they hadn't known how to create value for others, only how to extract it. Margaret Chen had become an unexpected ally and friend. At 75, she'd decided to volunteer with the foundation, using her decades of administrative experience to help streamline our operations. She'd also become the keeper of Uncle Victor's memory, sharing stories about his business philosophy and his quiet acts of generosity that even I hadn't known about. He used to say that the best investments were the ones that paid dividends in human dignity, she told me one afternoon as we sorted through applications for emergency housing assistance. He never wanted credit for the help he provided because he said recognition would cheapen the gift. That philosophy had become the foundation's unofficial motto. We helped people without requiring them to be grateful, without making them prove their worthiness, without expecting them to change their circumstances beyond what was necessary for housing stability. Uncle Victor had understood that poverty was often about circumstances rather than character, and our programs reflected that understanding. The foundation's success had also created new challenges. Other wealthy families approached me regularly, wanting to establish similar organizations or asking for advice about philanthropic giving. I'd learned to be selective about these conversations because many people were more interested in the tax benefits and social recognition of charity than in actually solving problems. One particularly memorable encounter had occurred at a fundraising gala for the Seattle Symphony. A real estate developer worth hundreds of millions had cornered me near the silent auction tables, explaining his vision for a homeless shelter that would be beautiful enough to enhance property values rather than diminish them. The key, he'd explained with complete seriousness, is making sure the homeless people understand that they're guests in our community, not permanent residents. We provide temporary assistance while encouraging them to relocate to areas where housing costs are more appropriate for their income levels. I'd excused myself from that conversation as politely as possible, but it had crystallized something important about the difference between charity and justice. Too many wealthy people wanted to help the poor in ways that preserved existing systems rather than changing them. They were comfortable providing temporary relief, but uncomfortable addressing the structural inequalities that created poverty in the first place. Uncle Victor had been different. His gift hadn't been designed to make me feel good about helping people. It had been designed to give me the resources to actually change systems and solve problems. The difference was crucial, and it influenced every decision the foundation made. Our latest project was a collaboration with the city to develop affordable housing units that would remain affordable in perpetuity, regardless of market fluctuations. It was a complex undertaking involving zoning negotiations, construction partnerships, and innovative financing structures, but it represented the kind of systematic change that Uncle Victor would have appreciated. The project had also brought me into contact with other philanthropists who shared similar values. I'd formed friendships with people who understood that wealth was a responsibility rather than a privilege, who measured their success by their impact rather than their net worth. These relationships had taught me that Uncle Victor's perspective on money wasn't unique, but it was rare enough to be precious. One of those friendships had developed into something more. David Restrepo was a pediatric surgeon who'd established a foundation providing free medical care to undocumented immigrants. We'd met at a conference on social entrepreneurship, bonding over our shared frustration with philanthropists who treated charity like a hobby rather than a calling. David had grown up in similar circumstances to mine, the son of Colombian immigrants who'd worked multiple jobs to support their family's small restaurant in Burien. He'd earned his medical degree through scholarships and student loans, choosing pediatric surgery because he wanted to help children who couldn't advocate for themselves. His foundation operated out of a converted warehouse, providing care with no questions asked and no paperwork required. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on shared values rather than shared circumstances. David drove a 10-year-old Subaru despite earning a surgeon's salary because he preferred investing his money in medical equipment for the foundation. He lived in a modest apartment near the hospital because proximity to work meant more time available for patients who needed him. When he'd learned about my inheritance, his first question hadn't been about my financial status or my lifestyle changes. He'd asked whether the money had altered my relationship with the work I loved. When I'd explained that it had simply amplified my ability to help people, he'd nodded with understanding and never mentioned the topic again. That response had told me everything I needed to know about his character. David saw my wealth the same way Uncle Victor had seen it, as a tool for service rather than a marker of status. He was attracted to my values rather than my bank account, interested in my foundation's work rather than my foundation's assets. We'd been dating for 8 months when he surprised me with a proposal that was perfectly suited to both our personalities. Instead of an expensive restaurant or romantic getaway, he'd proposed at the Foundation's annual Volunteer Appreciation Dinner, in front of the staff and volunteers who'd become our chosen family. "Rachel," he'd said, taking my hand as we stood before a room full of people who dedicated their time to helping others, "you've shown me that love isn't about what you can give to someone, but about what you can build together. Will you marry me and help me build something beautiful?" The engagement ring was his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small diamond that had been worn by a woman who'd raised 8 children while working as a seamstress. It was perfect because it represented continuity and commitment rather than expense and display. Planning our wedding had been surprisingly easy because we'd both wanted the same thing, a celebration that reflected our values rather than our financial capacity. We'd chosen a small ceremony in the community garden where the foundation had built its first transitional housing project, surrounded by families we'd helped and friends who shared our commitment to service. Uncle Victor would have loved the wedding. The guests included formerly homeless individuals who'd become homeowners, teenage mothers who'd graduated from college with foundation scholarships, and elderly immigrants who'd avoided eviction through our emergency assistance programs. These were the people whose lives had been changed by his gift, and their presence made the celebration feel like validation of his decision. My wedding dress had come from a local designer who specialized in sustainable fashion, created from fabric donated by a textile company that was closing its Seattle operations. The caterer was a refugee from Somalia who'd built a successful business with help from a foundation microloan program. The flowers were grown by an urban farming cooperative that employed people transitioning out of homelessness. Every detail had been chosen to support the community we served, demonstrating that significant occasions could be both beautiful and meaningful without being wasteful or excessive. The total cost of the wedding had been less than Derek had spent on his bachelor party in Las Vegas 3 years earlier, but the impact had been immeasurably greater. During the ceremony, David had spoken about finding someone who understood that healing people was about more than treating their immediate symptoms. I'd talked about learning that love, like wealth, was most valuable when it was shared generously rather than hoarded carefully. We'd exchanged vows promising to support each other's work and to raise any future children with the understanding that privilege came with responsibility. The wedding had been featured in Seattle Magazine as an example of meaningful luxury, but we'd declined most interview requests because we didn't want our personal choices to become a trend that missed the point. The goal wasn't to make expensive weddings seem wasteful, but to demonstrate that celebrations could be beautiful and significant without requiring enormous financial investment. 6 months after the wedding, we'd bought a house together in the Rainier Valley, a modest 3-bedroom home with a large garden where we planned to grow vegetables for the foundation's community meals program. The house was in the same neighborhood where many of our program participants lived, close enough to the foundation's offices that I could walk to work on nice days. The decision to live modestly despite having significant wealth had been deliberate and important to both of us. We wanted our daily lives to reflect our values, to remain connected to the community we served rather than separated from it by economic barriers. David had grown up understanding that money was a tool for security and opportunity, not for distance and display. I'd learned from Uncle Victor that wealth was most valuable when it enabled service rather than isolation. Our house had become a gathering place for foundation staff, volunteer coordinators, and program participants. Sunday dinners often included 12 to 15 people, a rotating mix of colleagues, friends and families we'd helped who'd become part of our extended community. The conversations around our dining room table ranged from policy discussions about affordable housing to personal updates about job searches, school applications, and family milestones. These gatherings reminded me constantly why Uncle Victor had chosen to structure his gift the way he had. He'd understood that wealth could either connect people or separate them, could either build community or destroy it. By leaving his money to someone who would use it for connection and community building, he'd ensured that his legacy would be measured in relationships rather than real estate, in impact rather than accumulation. The Foundation's third annual report had been published the previous month, documenting our progress and outlining our goals for the coming year. The numbers were impressive: 847 families helped, 1,200 individuals housed, 34 community partnerships established, 12 policy changes influenced. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real measure of our success was in the details that couldn't be quantified. The 8-year-old who'd written me a thank you letter in careful block printing, explaining that she liked having her own bedroom for the first time. The grandmother who'd been able to keep custody of her grandchildren because we'd helped her avoid eviction. The veteran who'd found permanent housing after 3 years of living in his car, who now volunteered at our intake center, helping other veterans navigate the system. Each story represented Uncle Victor's vision made real, his understanding that investment in human dignity generated returns that couldn't be measured in dollars but could be felt in every life touched by his gift. The foundation had become exactly what he'd hoped it would be, a mechanism for transforming wealth into wisdom, resources into relationships, money into meaning. Looking ahead, David and I had begun discussing the possibility of starting a family, children who would grow up understanding that privilege was a responsibility rather than a right, that wealth was a tool for service rather than a symbol of status. We wanted to raise kids who would choose their careers based on their passions rather than their profit potential, who would measure their success by their impact rather than their income. I often thought about what Uncle Victor would say if he could see the foundation now, thriving and growing and touching lives in ways that extended far beyond what either of us had initially imagined. I suspected he'd be pleased but not surprised, because he'd always understood that the best investments were the ones that generated compound returns in human dignity and community strength. Margaret Chen had shared one final story about Uncle Victor during the Foundation's 3rd anniversary celebration. She'd told us about a conversation they'd had shortly before his death, when he'd expressed concern about whether I would be able to handle not just the inheritance but the isolation that often came with significant wealth. He worried that money would change your relationships with people, she'd explained. He'd seen how wealth could make people suspicious of others' motives, how it could create barriers between family members and friends. He wanted to make sure his gift would enhance your ability to connect with people rather than diminish it. Looking around the anniversary celebration, held in the community center where I'd started my career, I could see that Uncle Victor's concern had been unfounded. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by his gift, but more importantly, people who'd become genuine friends and chosen family members. The wealth hadn't isolated me from community, it had given me the resources to build stronger, more meaningful communities. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, David and I walked through the neighborhood where we'd first met some of the families we'd helped. The houses were modest but well maintained, their front yards filled with children's toys and vegetable gardens. Porch lights illuminated families sharing dinner on warm evenings, neighbors chatting across fence lines, teenagers playing basketball under streetlights. This was Uncle Victor's true legacy, not the dollar amount of his gift, but the community it had helped create and sustain. He'd understood that wealth was meaningless unless it contributed to human flourishing, that success was hollow unless it lifted others along the way. His decision to leave his fortune to the family member who would use it for service rather than accumulation had ensured that his values would outlive his physical presence. 3 years later, I finally understood the full wisdom of Uncle Victor's choice. He hadn't just given me money, he'd given me the opportunity to discover what I was truly capable of accomplishing when resources weren't a limiting factor. He'd trusted me with his life's work, and in doing so, he'd enabled me to discover my own. The poor cousin had inherited much more than $20 million. She'd inherited a mission, a community, and a legacy of service that would continue long after the original fortune had been transformed into something immeasurably more valuable, a better world for everyone who needed help finding their way home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.